Hello all, and welcome to the December Collaborate event on abolishing slavery in our supply chains. My name is Jack White, and I'll be the host for today's event. Please feel free to pose any questions in the bottom right-hand corner. We will answer those when we have some time at the end. So today, we will be taking a global approach to abolishing slavery in our supply chains, as to ensure that good practice is shared and our supply chains have awareness of policy and legislation globally. So today's speakers are as follows. Introductions to the panelists and to the topic were done by myself, a recent joiner to QinetiQ and its graduate scheme. This will follow Hannah Cowley from QinetiQ UK. She sits within sustainable procurement and she will be giving a global perspective. Then we'll follow Claire Little from QinetiQ Australia, Nicola OConnor from Bird & Bird, and finally Catherine Karopa from QinetiQ Germany. And then at the end, we will do a Q&A session. So previous events have detailed our approach to slavery. For example, Tackling Modern Slavery was our last Collaborate event, and that focused on sort of recent developments surrounding things like COVID-19 and gave some good practice case study to sort of apply to your own companies. So today's event will carry on that narrative on a global scale. So what is the significance of hosting this event today? This aligns with the UN's International Day for the Abolition of Slavery, focusing on contemporary forms of slavery. And so we must kind of ask the question, what can we do as individuals, locally and globally, to abolish slavery in our supply chains? I will now pass along to Hannah Cowley. Hannah, please let me know when you wish to switch slides.
Okay, hello, thank you everybody for joining today. I'm just going to be giving you a global overview of what we're doing within QinetiQ with regards to tackling modern slavery within our supply chains. I'm the Sustainable Procurement Lead within the procurement function. Slide, Jack. So modern slavery is legislation and regulations around the world are changing, and that's not just within the UK. Back end of last year, Modern Slavery Act was identified as needing updating from the original 2015 version, and our panelist today, Nicola, will go into more detail regarding this one. And the same with the Australian Modern Slavery Act, which came out in 2018. There's been developments with that and the embedding of it within the businesses, and our colleague today, Claire, will be going into more detail around that. But the other businesses we've listed here are from all the areas around the country, around the globe, sorry, where we are operating. So Canada, they're also looking at it at the moment. It's not gone through their parliament as yet, but is being reviewed as currently. The European Commission is set to introduce human rights due diligence, so that is being reviewed at the moment and is coming out in different forms within the countries within the EU. And Catherine is going to follow that up later with what's happening in Germany, and particularly with the introduction of the German Due Diligence Act. And but also, it should be said, from our American point of view, the California Transparency Act has been around for some time and actually predates the UK Modern Slavery Act. And although there haven't been any changes to that legislation as it stands, what is happening at the moment is, particularly with reference to what's happening in China and specifically within the Xinjiang area around the Uyghur Muslims, America has been quite strong and firm in applying sanctions to corporations, organisations and individuals. So they are actively operating with regards to human rights and modern slavery. Next slide, please. So how are we responding to the requirement? Well, as under both the UK and Australian Modern Slavery Acts, there is a need for us as an organisation to publish our Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking Statement. This was updated back in June, end of June, our 5th statement, which is available on our website. As part of UK government requirements, recent changes have required us to actually register that statement on a UK government register. And also, one of the things that we've had to do for the first time this year is complete what's called the Modern Slavery Assessment Tool, or MSAT for short. This is an online government assessment questionnaire, for want of a better analysis of what it is. It's a survey, and it allows the government IPT procurement teams to see the status of where that we are. So as they're going through their bidding process, they can see the assessment that we've undertaken, and the tool provides a series of recommendations. It identifies any red flag areas, and that's gone into our QinetiQ-wide internal action plan that we have. So we have a series of global actions, but we also identify specific actions relevant to each of the global entities, and I'm sure Claire and Catherine will go into some of those in their presentations. And one of the key areas for that we are working on is the requirement for training, particularly ensuring relevant training is given to not just the procurement functions, which is the obvious candidate, anyone who operates within our supply chains. We provide training, so therefore encompassing roles such as supply quality assurance, anybody involved in HR around the recruitment process and dealing with suppliers around the recruitment piece. All of these are key areas where slavery may be witnessed or occur within our supply chains, which is obviously what we're focusing on. Next slide, Jack, thanks. So what are the common problems? Whether or not they're common is probably up for debate. I think it's pretty assured that a lot of the things that we're talking about aren't that near to home, in the fact that it's not necessarily our tier 1 suppliers that we're truly worried about. A lot of the things that we're concerned about are the tier 2s and beyonds, dependent on what countries and the particular categories that we're operating in. But you can see here a number of areas where the opportunities for slavery and human rights labour abuses can be more commonplace, and therefore it's our responsibility to ensure that we understand our supply chains, and getting to know them beyond just the tier 1s. Hence why we're talking to you today, because obviously to be able to do that, we need your help and we need your support, because as a number of you may already experience, particularly with in the defence sector, supply chains can be multi-tiered. And it's not necessarily that we have that ultimate relationship with the OEM or the originator, the original manufacturing company or service provider. So these are the areas where we need to focus in on. Jack, next slide. So one of the key things we've been doing is we've been identifying the high-risk countries. So this is an internal assessment identifying high-risk countries based on the Global Slavery Index and also the Corruption Transparency Index. And also there, we've referenced the source, the Product of Slavery Organisation. And these are the countries we believe where slavery is of concern and that we need to be more vigilant. So one of the things that we're doing is all the suppliers that we operate go through our supplier assessment tool, which for those who are familiar with it is JOSCAR, but also doing additional and regular sanctions checks to ensure that the suppliers in these countries are not increasing reputational damage to ourselves, and therefore we're keeping an increased watch on adverse media. Then next slide, please, Jack. So what are we expecting from you today, and why are we talking to you today? So we're in the process of updating our supplier code of conduct. It's a global supplier code of conduct. It's currently at the printers in a digital sense, obviously in a sustainable non-paid sense, and that's going to be published shortly. But it's highlighting the needs of that we're expecting the suppliers to operate the same standards that we operate to, and that we're looking for our suppliers to flow these down to their suppliers. As we said, if we've got multi-tiered supply chains, we need all the suppliers to be operating to the same level as we are, and that the risk of modern slavery is considered at every step in that procurement process. So it's not just thought of once, it's thought of during onboarding, it's thought of during tender assessment reviews, it's thought of during contract management. And that the vulnerable groups are do we have any categories, or are we operating in any countries where there are vulnerable worker groups, and we've named just some there, migrants, women, refugees and children. You know, we need to be cognizant of the local conditions that we're working in, and putting in the relevant reporting mechanisms for capturing and being able to allow organisations and individuals to report grievances, and therefore doing more to promote our Speak Up line. If there are any questions for me, I would say leave them till the end, or put them in the chat and we'll respond back as we go through. Thank you, Jack.
Lovely. Thanks, Hannah. I'll pass along now to Claire from Australia.
Jack, if you can go to the first slide for me.
Yep, of course.
Cool. Hi everyone, as Jack said, my name's Claire Little. I'm the General Manager here in QinetiQ, Australia. My role has responsibility for procurement and supply chain function, and so as a result I've been responsible for leading our actions here in Australia and addressing modern slavery risk in our supply chain. Next slide please, Jack. Just to give a little bit of perspective around our business. So QinetiQ commenced operations here in Australia back in 2008 when we first acquired 3 consulting businesses, and over the past 20 plus years, 10 plus years I should say, we've grown to over 600 employees and our business earning nearly $200 million Australian dollars in revenue. And today, this financial year, we've spent about $40 million on the supply chain. So while our roots are largely advisory services, which still represents a significant part of our revenue, we also are now offering a range of other services and products that are similar to what you would already be familiar with what QinetiQ offers in the UK and across other QinetiQ entities across the globe. Over the last 5 years, we've more than doubled our growth, and it's primarily because we've extended into what we call more below the line services, which is really about providing products and sustainment of products to our defence customer. So that's seen us move into very different types of procurement than what we've been used to into the past. Next slide, please, Jack. So in Australia, the Australian federal government introduced legislation back in 2018, and that commenced in January 2019. It essentially was just establishing a national modern slavery requirement, and it applies to all large businesses and certain other entities in the Australian market who have an annual consolidated revenue of at least 100 million Australian dollars. And so therefore it requires us to report on risk of modern slavery in our operation. Its key objective is to support the Australian business community in identifying and addressing their modern slavery risk, and to maintain some responsible and transparent supply chains. At the same time, we had one of our states introduce legislation as well, which was the New South Wales. So they also passed the legislation, but didn't actually come into effect because it had a number of inconsistencies with the federal legislation. However, we just recently had an amendment to that Act, and that will come into effect in January. It's recognised that it was trying to introduce additional reporting beyond what the federal government had introduced, but it still requires us to follow the federal reporting requirements and has a few other additional responsibilities. Because we work across all states and territories in Australia, both of those legislations apply to us. Next slide, Jack. So one of the advantages we had here in Australia was that the UK had already implemented the Modern Slavery Act a few years earlier. So we were able to draw on the best practices that UK had already started to put in place, and through working with our QinetiQ group procurement group, we were able to also understand what else is, they're identifying as best practice across other companies. So, we've probably done what most of other people have been doing. We did that first initial analysis. We did recognise that, as I mentioned before, we are primarily a consulting business and we're just starting to grow into other areas. So we did, with half our spend on consultancy, it's very low risk of those sorts of things being, in that having risk of supply chain, modern slavery. But we did identify 3 key risk areas that we're putting our first attention on, and they are things around cleaning, personal protective equipment and clothing and merchandise. As Hannah mentioned, there's a group-wide action plan that we've developed our own Australian annex, which also incorporates additional actions we're going to take in addition to the group action. We've also established a procurement plan. In the past, we were just dealing with the procurement as they happen. Now we're taking a much more strategic approach to it and ensuring that we're addressing modern slavery risk as a high priority. So that ensures that we're starting to work around looking at our cleaning contract and start to put in place what we're going to do around PPE and merchandise. We've drawn a lot on our group procurement processes, and so we've implemented their five-stage process and requiring engagement of my team where procurements exceed a certain amount or present a high level of risk. We've always been doing sanction checks, which is great, but we've strengthened our supplier assurance. So we now ask questions of our supply chain around, what sort of risks are in their supply chain around modern slavery, and we also ask them about whether they are required to report under the modern slavery legislation and are they in compliance with that. We also have, as part of that, it's a key part of our evaluation criteria and assessing tenders, we are considering modern slavery risk as part of that. And as Hannah mentioned, the supplier code of conduct, that's now incorporated in our supplier terms and conditions and strengthen those terms. The group has rolled out modern slavery training, and we're flowing that across all the people who are involved in procurement for more than 40% of their time. But we've also been running some awareness training across our leadership, because it's through the leadership and the people who are running our business that are best placed to be able to identify those types of risks. And then just finally, we submitted our first modern slavery statement back in 2020, and we've just recently submitted our second one. It's still using the same group modern slavery statement that Hannah flashed up before, which, working with our QinetiQ group, we were able to get that adjusted to ensure that we're meeting the criteria that the Australian legislation requires us to comply with. So yeah, there's been quite a fair bit of work in that space, and so we're really pleased with the progress that we've had over the past 2 years, but we do recognise we've got a long way to go, and really the only way we're going to do that is by working very closely with our supply chain and our other industry partners so that we can really make a difference with this important matter. So I'll hand back to you, Jack.
Wonderful. Thanks, Claire. Appreciate your time. And I'll pass along to Nicola OConnor.
Hi, thanks for inviting me today. I'm Nicola OConnor from Bird & Bird, and I'm a white-collar and corporate crime lawyer. The Modern Slavery Act is something very close to my heart, having spent many of my early years of my career in court seeing what happens on this topic for those people who are sadly caught up in modern slavery and those who are organising things. So I wonder if you can go on to the next slide, please. So today I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what the current position is, but actually the main focus that I've been asked to talk about is what might be coming your way soon. We can go on to the next slide, please. So I think it's worth having a look at what the modern slavery offences are. And the reason that I say that is that modern slavery is often used as quite an umbrella term. And it deals with all sorts of really good and ethical practices, but it's quite interesting to look at what actually are offences under the Modern Slavery Act. So we're talking about slavery, servitude, forced labour, You know, there are other things that are often talked about with modern slavery, minimum wage and those types of things, and they're all very, very good things to be looking at. But we're talking here about people who are being compelled to work, often in dangerous conditions, you know, and we're talking about people being compelled to work through many generations of families sometimes. Next slide, please. So often this is the point at which businesses look at, and they're looking at Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act and looking at what the requirements are for businesses. So within the UK, if you're doing business or part of your business within the UK, you're supplying goods and services, and you're a larger business, so you're looking at a annual turnover of something either equal or greater than 36 million, you will be familiar with Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act. I'm going to assume that quite a lot of you on this call are very familiar with all of this, so I'm not going to spend very much time on it. What I think is quite interesting actually within the last couple of years is how many businesses are coming to us for advice that aren't required to provide modern slavery statements, but nevertheless want policies and procedures in place, and sometimes are putting up modern slavery statements because they want to advertise issues that they hold dear and think are important. And I find that really encouraging, how many different companies are coming to us to talk about that. And even in the UK, we've had the UK government publishing modern slavery statements, even though they don't have to. So I think all of those positive developments. Next slide, please. So if you're compelled to provide a modern slavery statement, you'll no doubt be aware of the types of things that you need to include within that statement. And they can be very time consuming, preparing all of the information that you need to provide your modern slavery statement. So information about your organization's structure, your policies, very importantly, your due diligence processes, which we've heard a little bit about earlier today. Which parts of the business have got the greatest risk, parts of the supply chain? We heard Hannah talking about hotspots around the world and places where you're having to think about you are operating in where you have suppliers. But it's also really important to think about the UK. Within COVID, we're within a pandemic. There are an awful lot of things happening to vulnerable people all over the world, not excluding the UK. There's plenty happening here in the UK. Next slide, please. So we've heard about this from Hannah a little earlier. So 11th of March, the Modern Slavery Statement Registry was live. If you have a look on there, there are lots of modern slavery statements. The idea was that potential investors might be looking at it. People who perhaps are thinking about being employed by your company might be looking at it, as well as all sorts of other people who have interest in modern slavery issues. If you have a look at the registry, it sometimes can be a bit tricky to find the organisation that you're looking for, but they are nevertheless all there. Now, you've heard in relation to Australia that their Modern Slavery Act has come after ours, but since 2015 there has been an awful lot of discussion about beefing up our Modern Slavery Act and the penalties for not doing things. And sadly, we've been a bit slow on making progress on that. So I just want to deal with what is happening at the moment and what might be coming your way. Next slide, please. So at the moment, we have a private members bill going through the House of Lords, and it's had its first reading only on the 15th of June. I checked this morning. We're still awaiting the second reading, so this may or may not ever make it into law, but I think it's quite interesting to see what's being discussed and what's being talked about. So the idea will be that there will be a criminal offence to publish a false modern slavery statement. So a person who is responsible for a slavery and human trafficking statement will commit a criminal offence if the information in the statement is false or incomplete in a material particular, and the person knows or is reckless as to whether it is. So, first concept, a responsible person. Who might be the person that's going to have to say, yeah, I'm responsible for the modern slavery statement? Well, it needs to be someone very senior in an organisation. So it might be a director, might be a member of an LLP or a partner in a partnership. So it's got to be somebody pretty senior in the organisation. Next slide, please. And I think probably the reason it's got to be somebody senior is that they need to have all the information available and they need to make sure it's correct. But the penalty, if you are putting yourself forward as the responsible person, is that you personally could end up with a custodial sentence of up to 2 years if what is contained within that statement is incorrect. As far as the business is concerned, we could be looking at a fine amounting to 4% of your annual global turnover. And this is capped at 20 million, but is a pretty large amount, in addition to somebody personally being held responsible and ending up in prison. The commissioner is going to be given powers, if this was to go through, to issue formal warnings to commercial organisations who fail to meet the requirements of these minimum standards of disclosure. And the commercial organisation commits an offence if it continues after that warning to source from suppliers or sub-suppliers that fail to demonstrate minimum standards of transparency. Again, we're looking at a huge fine, the same type of fine that we just talked about earlier. Next slide, please. So if you are the responsible person, your only defence that is being proposed under the bill is that you have taken all reasonable steps to ensure that your slavery and human trafficking statement is correct. And very importantly, you contact the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner as soon as practicable once you become aware that there is something in the statement that is incorrect in some way. So that's the only way that you would have a defence in law if you do both of those things. Next slide, please. The bill also introduces some requirements of disclosure and transparency for commercial organisations, and these seem to be quite onerous. So you have to publish and verify information about the country of origin of sourcing inputs in the supply chain. You need to report the use of employment agents that might be acting on behalf of overseas governments, and arrange for credible external inspections, audits, unannounced spot checks. And this goes a lot further than most companies would have as part of their modern slavery toolkit at the moment to check what's going on in their supply chain. Next slide, please. So, I mean, practical issues that you're going to need to consider if this becomes law. Each organisation is going to need to consider methods to gather all of the relevant data that's going to be required of them. You perhaps need to reconsider contractual terms with your suppliers so that you can gather this information more easily. Because this is a bill and it's still being discussed, it's not yet clear where the reports of the country of origin of sourcing inputs should be reported. Businesses, as part of the information they're going to need to gather, they'll need to keep track of use of employment agents acting on behalf of overseas governments. How will you make a report? We don't know yet. And I think the biggest issue for me really is the inspections and audits. How are we going to pick credible external providers? You know, how will those be flagged? Will they be approved? We don't know. How far down the supply chain will you need to check what exactly are the inspectors going to be examining? What is it that they need to look at? So we heard Hannah talking about sort of first tier providers, but are we going down second, third, fourth? The nuts and bolts of something? Are we looking at how they're made to make a particular product? It seems pretty onerous, and at the moment, obviously, we don't have any guidance on how that will take place. Next slide, please. I'm happy to answer any questions at the end, along with anybody else, if you have any in relation to the private members bill. Thank you.
Wonderful, Nicola. Thank you. I'll now pass along to Catherine.
Thank you all for joining. My name is Catherine. I'm the responsibility for the supply chain in Germany. And so, for us, we get also a new things coming up. It is for the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. It is very similar to the Modern Slavery Act in the UK. So for Germany, companies with at least more than 3,000 employees, and if they are registered in Germany, have to follow strict procedures in regard to the modern slavery or human rights, also in environmental topics. The companies, the new law is starting from the year 23. So then we are held to follow that new rules. Affected, as I said it, at least about more than 3,000 people. From the year 23, from 24, it is decreased to 1,000 employees. This means all companies who are stated in the German located in Germany and who has an administrative seat or branch there is concerned of this law. Not only this is a thing where you can be involved in that law, it is also a special or individual contract what can be agreed between you and your customer or another person. And that is also a thing where you can be forced to go forward with these rules. For our branch in Germany, at the moment, we are in a size where we are not concerned by the law. But I think we are one QinetiQ and we are follow the global rules and want to make sure that we are on the right path, because after the year 24, the government will decide if it will be more strict rules or other changes will coming up. So what is the act requiring? The act is requiring that a risk management or risk analysis are implemented. So we have to look for appropriate strategies to avoid violations against human rights as well as environmental topics. So policy statements and creating human rights strategies are in work. We are we have to follow that on 23, so everything here on track. The new law is also requiring preventive and medical measures. That means you have not only to say, yes, I do it, you have to document that, you have to implement it, and you have to show it to the government whenever they want it, and to ensure that you are not doing something what you are not allowed to. So documentation and reporting obligations, that is a background you have to do, otherwise you can get in big troubles. Next slide, please. So what are the problems or the risks? So from the year 23, when companies will be will do things against this law, they can get penalties up to 8 million. It's, I think, a very high amount which can damage your whole company. So this is one point, which companies are involved. It is companies with more than 400 million a year can be fined up with 2% of the average of the annual turnover. That is the penalties, and I think you should not go against this law. Another thing what you can get is an exclusion of the public tender, so you cannot quote and you cannot get any turnover. So penalties very high. Risk for QinetiQ at the moment low, because the law is comes into force from 23. We are started with a project in this month, so we have enough time and absolutely on track. So I would like to give you a quick overview about the actions we are currently doing on going aligned to this law. So we created a supply chain roundtable with the responsibilities. So this includes management, the compliance, and legal department. So we have a new guy in place for the legal topics, what this law is requiring. So this law said you must have a person, a legal person in place. So we have that in place since last month, because we have a lot of contracts which have to be reviewed and reworked where we need the legal support here. So next point, reviewing active contracts. I just communicated that to you. It is very important because the new law requires new contracts, because you have to involve the code of conduct. You have to include the compliance rules of your company. For example, I think the UK has a lot of experience in advance, because your Modern Slavery Act is valid since 6 years. So we have a lot of good ideas given from the UK. So very important for us is in implementation of a central contract management, for example, with an automatic alert system. You have to document it, you have to review and monitor all your suppliers and processes. So I think you should try to get it in an automatic mechanism, because manual handwork is not possible. Otherwise, you will need 5 other persons for that. Harmonizing of the supplier selection and the control process. I think the law is requiring that you start in the beginning of the process, and that is the contracting with the suppliers or with another customer. So you should have the right contracts in place to ensure that you are safe with this new rules of the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. Improving supplier evaluation process. We are have analyzed the country of origin where we're buying. So 80% of our purchasing volume is in Europe. So also there is a risk in a good level where we can handle it. Other countries, for example, China, which is a risk country in regard to the modern slavery of our experience of the past, so we are not buying. For example, when we would buy there, we would have to include a strict procedure how we can monitor it and how we can ensure that no violations against the rules are given. So we will implement an annual review and information to the management. That is normal procedure in this act, and training videos and interactive tests. We started with a leadership team last month. Thank you, Hannah, for providing the videos. So we will improve that for all employees, for example, in German language, because to ensure that everyone, also from the employees, can understand and have 100% the right information. So that's from my side. We are working on, yes, next slide. Thank you, Jack. So we have started with a current risk analysis, and the result for this moment is a very low risk, and we are on track with this project, and we'll work with Australia and with UK very close, because there are more experiences for us as this very new process. So thank you for joining, and I will give back to Jack. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Catherine. It was wonderful. Right, we'll move on to the Q&A for the last 15 minutes now. Hannah, if you wouldn't mind sort of reading out a few of the questions, maybe you can pose them to the panel.
Yeah, we've had a couple of questions. So one came in from John. How far down the supply chain do we expect suppliers to visit and audit subcontractors and component suppliers? Flowing down terms and conditions doesn't help on its own unless audits are being performed. Obviously, this has a high cost associated with it, which needs to be recovered, and in a competitive environment, it's not always possible. What weighting do QinetiQ apply to the evaluation processes for companies that can evidence audits are being performed? I don't mind answering to begin with, and if anyone else wants to join in and provide their viewpoint. For me, it's not a nice to have, it's something that we've got to start doing. This has to be business as usual. The way we would audit suppliers in terms of ISO 9000, for instance, quality audits, those audits now need to be combined so that they're also covering off social requirements, environmental requirements. They need to become more holistic, encompassing assessments. Audit sounds quite negative. One of the things that I think would be interesting is you're now, particularly around the social assessment, you're now starting to see companies going for third-party assessments from organisations such as like the Responsible Business Alliance. And I think not immediately, because it's not going to happen overnight, but I think it will be one of those ones that where we're engaging with suppliers, particularly say for the first time, if they have a third-party assessment such as EcoVadis or Responsible Business Alliance, it operates in the same way that that ISO badge does, that you know, there's not a need for us to do that assessment, that you've already had that assessment performed, and therefore we're going to take you at your word for it. I think it's a little while before we're there. I know some of the large companies do have that in place, but it's I definitely see that's the way things are going. Until then, I think there's obviously the responsibility on each organisation doing their own due diligence, picking up what Nicola said in her presentation. Your only defence is that we did everything possible. So we have to have the processes and procedures in place, and we have to carry them out. But obviously you're doing it in a relevant, pragmatic way. You know, you're doing your, where are my high risks? Have I got high risk by country? Have I got high risk by category? And that changes as you go down the supply chain. So the requirement is on each tier being aware of what they're doing and what they're providing and what their supply chain below them looks like. I hope that answers your question, John, but for any of the other panelists, if you would like to jump in on that one. No? Silence. I obviously said the right thing. The next question that came in was, is there an obligation to provide a statement of compliance on a program by program basis, or is it acceptable to show the statement of compliance at an organisational level? Nicola, do correct me if I've got this wrong, but it's definitely, the statements exist at organisational level. However, the interesting thing that's come around recently, particularly in the UK, is under the Social Value Act, and particularly the social value model that's being applied to central government departments, modern slavery forms part of the economic inequality theme. And so therefore, if it's included by the customer as something that they want to look at, particularly Ministry of Defence and Home Office are picking up on this. So if modern slavery is there, you would have to report on it at a programme project level. Did I miss anything, Nicola? I'm not sure she can hear me. Nope. Okay. So hopefully that answered Richard's question.
Sorry, I'm having trouble with I was chattering away and having trouble. I'm now definitely off mute. Sorry, I was saying, yes, it is, of course, you're right, at an organisational level. But I mentioned during my speech, my talk, that there's quite a lot of other businesses that are interested for lots of reasons. And lots of other businesses can find themselves being, needing to provide information statements because of their connection with businesses that are asking and compelling you really to provide that information. So it's not just centered around the Modern Slavery Act requirements, it's a lot broader than that, and I think that's fantastic actually for us all.
Yeah, no, very good point. And the final question we have here at the moment from Michael, thank you. What about companies supplying directly or indirectly to countries that don't share our values, and not just with regards to modern slavery? I mean, this is just an interesting point of doing businesses with companies in other parts of the world. You very much have to be cognizant of their cultural diversity, the way they operate. Some of those are good, some of those are obviously not so good, and they increase the risks of doing business in those countries. And that comes from modern slavery, human rights, but the whole ethics, anti-bribery and corruption agenda. You know, that's why these indices exist for, say, global slavery and the global corruption indices. And so you have to take a measured approach of who you're dealing with, why you're dealing with them, are there other suppliers in the marketplace, but being cognizant of their cultural norms, and identifying whether or not they're risks to your business in terms of a reputational. So for me, it's each of those suppliers, and within those countries, you almost have to deal with them almost on a case-by-case basis, but you have to have the processes in place to support you as a business of operating in those countries. Does anyone else, Catherine or Claire, want to add to that?
Yes, I agree, absolutely. You cannot, in my eyes, you cannot define one rule for everyone, because the business are very, very different, and you have to update and adapt the processes in accordance to your business, and not to a rule. It is to build up around the rule, in my eyes.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Can I mention one other thing? Yes,
Absolutely.
countries, obviously there are certain countries that have very different maybe sort of ethical considerations, but I think it's worth looking at the actual businesses you're dealing with as well. And it doesn't actually necessarily matter where those businesses are. If they're businesses you're dealing with that don't seem to have any policies and procedures in place when you're asking for information, there's a long delay before you're getting it. They're perhaps businesses that you want to be very cautious about dealing with, because maybe they don't have really the right kind of ethics, policies, procedures, codes in place to have any idea what's in their own supply chain. And that often is the big issue, which is who is in your supply chain. Do you actually know who is in your supply chain? Particularly in times of COVID, where lots of things are changing, people are dealing with lots of different partners. Are they on top of all of that? And if you're dealing with a business that seems very relaxed and laid back about some fundamental policies, not just modern slavery, financial crime, it's as a whole is an issue, money laundering, bribery and corruption. If they seem very relaxed and don't have the proper things in place for that, then they're perhaps not companies that you perhaps want to be doing business with, no matter where they are. They can be in the UK, they can be all over the world.
That's a really good point, Nicola. I think one of the key elements is, for me, the supply chain is an extension of your business. So the supply chain you're working with is, and that goes back to the expectations we have and why we write things like supplier codes of conduct, is we all want to be operating from the same standards and expectations. And it's a supply chain that is supporting us as a business, and which is why Nicola eloquently put, it's about choosing to work with suppliers that are credible and reputable and not going to endanger the reputation of you as an organisation. And that's why, unfortunately, the due diligence around supplier onboarding and the continuous reassessment of suppliers has to be in place to make sure that we're being vigilant about who we're working with, because we're partners at the end of the day. To stamp out, we're partners in terms of what we deliver to our ultimate customers, but we're also partners in improving the world around us. And you know, there are different cultures around the world and business operations around the world, but at the same time there is that bigger piece of wanting to work to the same agenda. So part of the original Paris Agreement back in 2015 was the UN Sustainable Development Goals. All the countries signed up to that, and from a modern slavery point of view, that sat under goal number 8 about decent work. I think modern slavery falls under target 8.7, in that, you know, we all should be working towards that. And going back to Nicola's point, you have to look at each supplier and each business on their own merit, and it's not just their ability to deliver quality of goods and service. Quality of goods and services comes with this holistic approach of how they consider people, the planet, and the wider sustainability agenda. Said like a true sustainable procurement professional. They're all the questions that were in the chat and the Q&A. Are there any, does anybody want to voice a question? For anyone who didn't see, Andy asked if the slides were going to be shared. I believe that's correct, isn't it, Jack? They are, along with the recording of this webinar.
Yeah,
so.
they'll be available sort of soon after the event is over today.
In which case, I think do you want to wrap it up, Jack?
Yeah, of course. So thank you everyone for joining today, and particularly thank you to all the panelists. I hope everyone's kind of gained some knowledge on modern slavery and our sort of due diligence policies, our practices, and whether or not it can be applied to your own businesses. So once again, the slides will be available after the event is over, and I thank you very much for joining today.